Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Going to try something a little bit different for this solo show. All kinds of reasons. All kinds of reasons why. At its core, however, what I want to do is put two mostly 20th century American thinkers in conversation about story and telling a new story about telling new stories and why that's somewhat transformative. Well, it's completely transformative, okay? And that's the core, and the reason we're doing it this way is part of that process, telling a new story about telling new stories, is to focus on the telling, right? So it's not simply a linguistic or verbal event, but a voiced one. And I think it has to work this way because it's tied back into, for people who don't know, we've been renovating the house to some extent, emergency renovations that we can get done given the, collapse of worldwide economies and supply chains and all the rest of it. So just trying to get as many things done now as we might need in the medium term, right? But we're in the process of moving back into the house after all that has happened. And it occurred over a weekend of the Feast of the Assumption. And for the premium members, we did a Feast of the Assumption rosary discussion and then run through. And part of that rosary discussion was looking at the stories that shape Christianities in plural, right? And in that case, it's sort of the story of Mary being the shape of the liturgical calendar for about half of the Christian calendars, even though Jesus is the main event kind of thing. So it was... This solo show has to be part of nested performances moving in rather than simply descriptions in audio content that goes out. So that's why I'm trying it in a different way, which is to say I have the quotations that I'm going to be reading from the two pieces, right? These American thinkers. We'll get to them when we get to them. Other than that, I don't really have any notes. Usually when I do these things, it's a bit more organized. It's not all written out because I'm too lazy. But it is broken into sections. Now, the other reason this is a somewhat unusual approach, or atypical, or maybe even it's a new approach, I don't know yet, is that it's nested in with the same materia that made up a big part of a post I put out last week called How You Play Is What You Win. And this solo show was going to be done the week before, in fact, up in Brisbane. I was filming for the next series of Magical Egypt. But because it got entangled in that post, which started there and was inspired by some of the Charles Eisenstein stuff I was watching in Brisbane, it's all kind of bundled together. And then these things, you kind of know, I mean, this is how life works, right? But you kind of know that something real is going on when the things you want to do get caught up in and matched to the things going on in the wider waking world, right? So I'm trying to get across a collection of ideas that I guess exist in relation, and it's ideas that are in that post and in this show. I guess it's overly simplistic, but not exactly wrong to say that post from last week describes what I think we should be doing with this present moment. And the solo show, I hope, describes a kind of why, like a situating why, looking at telling the right sort of stories and as a result expressing the right kind of meaning. And it's a specific why, because the next 6 months, I mean, we've all probably listened to the solo show, and it's not just the next 6 months, but the next 6 months are rough. By now, I think we're all beginning to get a view of, and many of us had it for longer, just how rough things are about to get, right? So there's the sort of why that we need to sit with. It's almost like the biggest why, which is why you should stay on Earth. I know that sounds goth and dramatic, but despair is a real challenge or issue, and I'm having lots of private conversations about it, right? And when that happens, it means that there's a very public conversation that isn't happening because, referencing the previous post, people are self-censoring or what have you. And I've been sitting with, speaking of the Charles Eisenstein stuff I was watching in Brisbane, it's again nested in sort of some Starship stuff because of Magical Egypt and all these things that will unfold in the coming months. But Charles characterized despair as the dissolving of the container that you expected an answer to come in so that the actual answer may arrive. And that was really, really useful because, I'm back under quarantine or house arrest because I had the temerity to move about my country, and the police have told me they can show up at any time to make sure I haven't left my property. So there's a lot of there's despair at every corner of how we're trying to be in the world at the moment. And if you take what Charles said and apply that, it's because you, or in this case me, but like the royal you, expected the next 6 months to go a certain way, say halfway through last year. And it's not going to happen. And there's a despair in the dissolving of that container, so that what is actually going to happen, you need to allow it to arrive. And it's a really, I was galaxy brained by it, right? Because that is an almost instant cure for depression. To know that the despair you are feeling, which is very painful, is a dissolving. Like, it's a necessary pain, and it has that almost astrological medicine of it will pass. But it's Charles's thing. It's one of those things that's true even if it isn't, right? Like, if you just think of despair as being the necessary disintegration of the container in which you expected an answer to come so that the actual answer, which is differently shaped, can come through, then you have removed its capacity to destroy you. And that's good magic, right? This is a good example of language and metaphor as being transformative. So that was probably the piece that I was waiting for in Brisbane to, I guess, open the experimental solo show that is this one, because it's a good example of almost like a micro story. It's a fragment of Charles's kind of refrain of telling a new story, right? And it's good. And it's my opening to the two American thinkers that we're going to read through first. I'm going to share excerpts from two speeches, one of them given by the philosopher William James at Harvard, called What Makes Life Significant, which might, if you're a William James stan, and I know many of you are, this might be an unusual choice of speech because he literally basically has one on why you shouldn't kill yourself. But that's not the focus of this show. I did just want to center that there are levels of despair and suicidal ideation amongst people that a month ago were coping. And so we need this kind of like emergency intervention, transformative, switching up, paradigm, whatever words you want, Carol words, Charles words, go with it, right? We need those kind of interventions. And the What Makes Life Significant speech, I think, has not just the new story, but the living of the new story, right? So it's coming back to this not being a verbal event, but a voiced one, right? And the other thinker or speech is by 20th century theologian Walter Wink. And it's a rather famous one, which I think some of you may already know, called The Myth of Redemptive Violence. And I was going to include that as part of the post, how you play is what you win. But it's better here because and this is the Magical Egypt Starship stuff, it's a different characterization, but a good one, of the implications of the sort of Laurasian myth story that I talk about in Starships. And it's characterized, and there's some critiques of it, and I'll probably jump in at some points and mention that. It's characterized in such a way that it makes the presumption of violence being like the only solution, or that kind of combative war thinking, which was what the previous post was about. We assume that is baked into reality or universal, and what Wink's speech covers is that is simply historically and mythologically not the case, right? But before we get to these two thinkers, well, actually, sort of. We go William James, Walter Wink, William James. And there's a first bit of William James that we want to get to, and I guess I could call this section like the Kraken, or from the Kraken to the Cat. It's a weird way of thinking about it, but I wrote a post years ago called The Constellations of Cryptozoology. And it happened as I was flying from London to Hamburg for work, and I was flying over the ocean, and it was frozen. And I'd never seen frozen ocean. Well, obviously, it was the middle of winter, and it was whatever. But, I grew up in temperate coastal Australia. The ocean doesn't freeze. And it doesn't freeze that often on that flight either. It was a particularly cold winter. And I was struck by the idea that the world needs to still have big bits of mystery in it, right? And that was the consolation of cryptozoology. There's something healing about, in a funny way, speculating on the existence of Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, because what you're actually doing is accurately or not supernaturalizing the world. And I used, as I inevitably do, the example of the Kraken from the Pirates films, where once it had washed up dead, Jack Sparrow is upset, and it's really interesting. It's played really well, and I see his level of upset as the world is de-supernaturalizing. That's actually the tension in all the films, right? Like, it's a battle between the empire in the correct anarchist sense of it being both state and capitalism, East India Company, and squishy organic human freedom and free assembly and all the rest of it. And so Jack's upset, and the line is, Barbosa says the world used to be a bigger place, and Jack says the world's still the same, there's just less in it, right? And so cryptozoology is about kind of putting krakens, well, that post was about putting krakens back into the ocean. And it's one of the things I do to manage. This is about selecting stories, right? It's one of the things I do when it comes to managing mental health and depression. It's the middle of winter down here, so there's aspects of sad and dealing with what's going on in the world and all the rest of it. And my two ways of like regularly managing mental health involve travel, can't be done, and psychedelics, and especially travel for psychedelics, which have been cancelled 3 or 4 times because of what's going on, right? So I had exactly 3 psychedelic-based travel plans destroyed by our current situation. And usually, and actually this helped the first time everyone got arrested. Dr. Becca Tarnas had like an Escape to Middle Earth live watch along the Lord of the Rings films on Twitter, and that was super fun. And so Lord of the Rings is one of the kind of stories, or Middle Earth is a story I retreat to that's sort of been closed off to me because it's a road movie. So I derived nourishment and enrichment from being with that story as an entity because it's a road movie. So you could identify with, I mean, most people listening to this would, like, identify with Gandalf in a grey pilgrim moving about the world, at the behest of the forces of good kind of situation. But even if it's Aragorn or in the films anyway, Eowyn's tension about being in adventure and not being in adventure, that's what its medicine is for being a small thing trying to operate in the big wide world. Now, if the big wide world is removed from you, there's a disconnect between the medicinal powers of the story. So it stopped working. And the reason I mentioned cryptozoology and that together is William James is the originator of, it's paraphrased more often than phrased. I'm going to read you the actual thing. He says, we're like cats in the library. And that's kind of his version of, Charles Fort, which is we are aware of our existence in a universe that is beyond our comprehension to the same way that a cat in a library is. The cat may have some conception of humans and may have a visual representation of a book and may even see words with its eyes if it's sitting on like the lap of someone, but it doesn't understand books or what's in books or the rest of it, right? So I'm going to read you that quote. This is a quotation from William James. I firmly disbelieve myself that our human experience is the highest form of experience extant in the universe. I believe rather that we stand in much the same relation to the whole of the universe as our canine and feline pets do to the whole of human life. They inhabit our drawing rooms and libraries. They take part in scenes of whose significance they have no inkling. They are merely tangent to curves of history, the beginnings and ends and forms of which pass wholly beyond their ken. So we are tangent to the wider life of things. But just as many of the dogs and cats' ideals coincide with our ideals, and the dogs and cats have daily living proof of the fact, so we may well believe on the proofs that religious experience affords that higher powers exist and are at work to save the world on ideal lines similar to our own. Right? So there's, even with a lack of understanding, there are ways where interests and ideals can be in alignment. And that's kind of why I want to, well, it's not opening now, we're well and truly in the show, but why I wanted to open by recalling this idea of twisted language and metaphor, and how metaphor in certain parts of Amazonia is the dimensional bridge, is the dimensional surface, the common surface between like the waking and the spirit world. It's, I don't know whether it was accidentally or deliberately or just apt, right? The fact that William James is using a story about stories to say that there's a way we can operate that is in alignment with the forces of the universe, even if we can't understand them. It's basically metaphor or algebra, right? So that you use metaphor because you can't be in full alignment or comprehension of the thing. And if you get that language right, and this is the sort of work of magic in this metaphor of metaphors, then that's sort of what happens, right? And that's crucial. So it's about aligning with the stories in the books in the library, right? And this is, we may surmise, a extensive library. So when your ideals come into alignment with ideals of a particular reader or book, certain things happen and certain things don't. So I wanted to put that cryptozoological metaphor of stories at the beginning of this process, right? So, because now we're going to talk about the first story. We're going to talk the myth of redemptive violence, which is by Walter Wink, who was a 20th century American theologian. And it's one of his more famous essays or sermons. And we're not going to do the whole thing, but we're going to do a decent chunk of it, because it's exactly the idea of this, of like the story as hyperdimensional book in William James's library, right? So we'll begin. The belief that violence saves is so successful because it doesn't seem to be mythic in the least. Violence simply appears to be the nature of things. It's what works. It seems inevitable, the last and often the first resort in conflicts. If a god is what you turn to when all else fails, violence certainly functions as a god. What people overlook, then, is the religious character of violence. It demands from its devotees an absolute obedience unto death. This myth of redemptive violence is the real myth of the modern world, and not Judaism or Christianity or Islam is the dominant religion in our society today. When my children were small, we let them log an unconscionable amount of television, and I became fascinated with the mythic structure of cartoons. This was in the 1960s, when the death of God theologians were being feted on talk shows, and secular humanity's tolerance for religious myth and mystery were touted as having been exhausted. I began to examine the structure of cartoons and found the same pattern repeated endlessly. An indestructible hero is doggedly opposed to an irreformable and equally indestructible villain. Nothing can kill the hero, though for the first 3/4 of the comic strip or TV show, he, rarely she, suffers grievously and appears hopelessly doomed, until, miraculously, the hero breaks free, vanquishes the villain, and restores order until the next episode. Nothing finally destroys the villain or prevents his or her reappearance, whether the villain is soundly trounced, jailed, drowned, or shot into outer space. Thankfully, not all children's programs feature explicit violence, but the vast majority perpetuate the mythic pattern of redemptive violence in all its brutality. Few cartoons have run longer or been more influential than Popeye and Bluto. In a typical segment, Bluto abducts a screaming and kicking Olive Oyl, Popeye's girlfriend. When Popeye attempts to rescue her, the massive Bluto beats his diminutive opponent to a pulp, while Olive Oyl helplessly wrings her hands. At the last moment, as our hero oozes to the floor and Bluto is trying, in effect, to rape Olive Oyl, a can of spinach pops from Popeye's pocket and spills into his mouth. Transformed by this gracious infusion of power, he easily demolishes the villain and rescues his beloved. The format never varies. Neither party ever gains any insight or learns from these encounters. They never sit down and discuss their differences. Repeated defeats do not teach Bluto to honor Olive Oyl's humanity, and repeated pummelings do not teach Popeye to swallow his spinach before the fight. Something about this mythic structure rang familiar. Suddenly I remembered. This cartoon pattern mirrored one of the oldest continually enacted myths in the world, the Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish, from around 1250 BCE. The tale bears repeating because it holds the clue to the appeal of that ancient myth in our modern media. In the beginning, according to the Babylonian myth, Apsu, the father god, and Tiamat, the mother goddess, give birth to the gods. But the frolicking of the younger gods makes so much noise that the elder gods resolve to kill them so they can sleep. The younger gods uncover the plot before the elder gods put it into action and kill Apsu. His wife, Tiamat, the dragon of chaos, pledges revenge. Terrified by Tiamat, the rebel gods turn for salvation to their youngest member, Marduk. He negotiates a steep price. If he succeeds, he must be given chief and undisputed power in the assembly of the gods. Having extorted this promise, he catches Tiamat in a net, drives an evil wind down her throat, shoots an arrow that bursts her distended belly and pierces her heart. He then splits her skull with a club and scatters her blood in out-of-the-way places. He stretches out her corpse full length, and from it creates the cosmos. With all this blood and gore, no wonder this story proved ideal as a prototype of violent TV shows and Hollywood movies. In this myth, creation is an act of violence. Marduk murders and dismembers Tiamat, and from her cadaver creates the world. As French philosopher Paul Ricoeur observes in The Symbolism of Evil, order is established by means of disorder. Chaos is prior to order. Chaos represented by Tiamat, order represented by Marduk, high god of Babylon. Evil precedes good. The gods themselves are violent. The biblical myth in Genesis 1 is diametrically opposed to all this. Genesis 1, it should be noted, was developed in Babylon during the Jewish captivity there as a direct rebuttal to the Babylonian myth. Just as a sidebar, that's a theologian's account of creation. The magician's account is different, and chaos is there prior to God creating in Genesis 1 because the waters are there, and that's like literally the word in Babylonian. But, you know, we all have angles on these. This is Gordon talking, right? We all have angles on these things. The magician's account of creation is different to the theologian's, who's obviously going to be, not that I'm anti-Genesis, but is obviously going to be pro-Genesis, right? Back to Wink. The Bible portrays a good God who creates a good creation. Chaos does not resist order. Good is prior to evil. Neither evil nor violence is part of creation, but enter later as a result of the first couple's sin and the connivance of the serpent. Basically, good reality is thus corrupted by free decisions reached by creatures. In this far more complex and subtle explanation of the origin of things, violence emerges for the first time as a problem requiring solution. Now, I don't actually hate that characterization, but again, if you look at the cleanup job that Judaism and thus Christianity did to the story of how the universe came to be, it's because of that cleanup job we have things like Gnosticism, but also the Watchers, amongst other things, appear to be a kind of like another account for how bad things happen in the world, and it's crucial that they predate mankind in a way. So you can see in the wider texts of the wider early Judaic texts are grappling with this. Now, I think Wink's idea that they landed on a basically good reality is thus corrupted by free decisions reached by creatures is fair. We can, again, this isn't the point of the show, but we're in it, right? What that essentially does is shifts blame onto humans rather than the creator for bad things in the world, which, like, is a move. It's not the Gnostic move, and it's not the only move. But I think Wink's characterization is fair. Anyway, that's not the point. We shall return to him now. In the Babylonian myth, however, violence is no problem. It is simply a primordial fact. The simplicity of this story commended it widely, and its basic mythic structure spread as far as Syria, Phoenicia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Germany, Ireland, India, and China. Typically, a male war god residing in the sky fights a decisive battle with a female divine being, usually depicted as a monster or dragon, residing in the sea or abyss. This is the feminine element, right? Having vanquished the original enemy by war and murder, the victor fashions a cosmos from the monster's corpse. Cosmic order requires the violent suppression of the feminine and is mirrored in the social order by the subjection of women to men and people to rule. So God breathing on the water is that reorganization of a pre-existing feminine universe. So it's surprising that he misses it, but nevertheless his point is made, and I agree with it. And that's very Starship's Laurasian thinking, right? After the world has been created, the story continues. The gods, imprisoned by Marduk for siding with Tiamat, complain of the poor meal service. Marduk and his father Ea therefore execute one of the captive gods, and from his blood Ea creates the human beings to be servants to the gods. The implications are clear. Human beings are created from the blood of a murdered god. Our very origin is violence. Killing is in our genes. Humanity is not the originator of evil, but merely finds evil already present and perpetuates it. Our origins are divine, to be sure, since we are made from a god, but from the blood of an assassinated god. We are the outcome of deicide. Human beings are thus naturally incapable of peaceful coexistence. Order must continually be imposed upon us from on high. Men over women, masters over slaves, priests over laity, aristocrats over peasants, rulers over people. Unquestioning obedience is the highest virtue, and order the highest religious value. As Marduk's representative on earth, the king's task is to subdue all those enemies who threaten the tranquility that he has established on behalf of the god. The whole cosmos is a state, and the god rules through the king. Politics arise within the divine sphere itself. Salvation is politics. The masses identify with the god of order against the god of chaos and offer themselves up for the holy war that imposes order and rule on the peoples round about. Ask me again, why pacifist anarchism? In short, the myth of redemptive violence is the story of the victory of order over chaos by means of violence. It is the ideology of conquest, the original religion of the status quo. The gods favored those who conquer. Conversely, whoever conquers must have the favor of the gods. The common people exist to perpetuate the advantage that the gods have conferred upon the king, the aristocracy, and the priesthood. Religion exists to legitimate power and privilege. Life is combat. Any form of order is preferable to chaos according to this myth. Ours is neither a perfect nor a perfectible world. It is theatre of perpetual conflict in which the prize goes to the strong. Peace through war. Security through strength. These are the core convictions that arise from this ancient historical religion, and they form the solid bedrock on which the domination system is founded in every society. The Babylonian myth is far from finished. It is as universally present and earnestly believed today as at any time in its long and bloody history. It is the dominant myth in contemporary America. It enshrines the ritual practice of violence at the very heart of public life, and even those who seek to oppose its oppressive violence do so violently. So that's kind of why we're talking about it now and how it ties back to the previous post. We have already seen how the myth of redemptive violence is played out in the structure of children's cartoons cartoon shows and is found as well in comics, video and computer games, and movies. But we also encounter it in the media, in sports, in nationalism, in militarism, in foreign policy, in televangelism, in the religious right, and in the self-styled militia groups. What appears so innocuous in cartoons is, in fact, the mythic underpinnings of a violent society. The psychodynamics of the TV cartoon or comic book are marvelously simple. Children identify with the good guy so that they can think of themselves as good. This enables them to project out onto the bad guy their own repressed anger, violence, rebelliousness, or lust, and then vicariously to enjoy their own evil by watching the bad guy initially prevail. This segment of the show, the Talmuz element, where the hero suffers, actually consumes all but the closing minutes, allowing ample time for indulging the violent side of the self. When the good guy finally wins, viewers are then able to reassert control over their own inner tendencies, repress them, and re-establish a sense of goodness without coming to any insight about their own inner evil. The villain's punishment provides catharsis. One forswears the villain's ways and heaps condemnation on him in a guilt-free orgy of aggression. Salvation is found through identification with the hero. Only the names have changed. Marduk subdues Tiamat through violence, and though he kills Tiamat, chaos incessantly reasserts itself and is kept at bay only by repeated battles and by the repetition of the Babylonian New Year's festival, where the heavenly combat myth is ritually reenacted. Theologian Willis Ellett's observation underscores the seriousness of this entertainment. The birth of the world, or cosmogony, is the birth of the individual, egogony. You are being birthed through how you see all things as being birthed. Therefore, whoever controls the cosmogony controls the children. The myth of redemptive violence is the simplest, laziest, most exciting, uncomplicated, irrational, and primitive depiction of evil the world has ever known. Furthermore, its orientation toward evil is one into which virtually all modern children, boys especially, are socialized in the process of maturation. Children select this mythic structure because they have already been led by culturally reinforced cues and role models to resonate with its simplistic view of reality. Its presence everywhere is not the result of a conspiracy of Babylonian priests secretly buying up the mass media with Iraqi oil money, but a function of values endlessly reinforced by the domination system. By making violence pleasurable, fascinating, and entertaining, the powers are able to delude people into compliance with a system that is cheating them of their very lives. So there's more, and if I remember, if not, you can just Google the myth of redemptive violence if I forget to put it in the show notes, but I probably will remember. What I like about this, other than, again, we can argue a little bit about Genesis, but if you put what Wink said in that speech along a Starship's timeline, you realize, and it's kind of getting back to what Carol said and what the previous post was, is this combative solutionism is brief and new. It's like 5,000 years old. If you look at earlier creation stories, they don't have, and this is I think it's older than 5,000. I think that this, what Wink is describing is the sort of emergence of the Laurasian myth. So it's about 20,000 years old, 20 to 50, closer to the 20. But the point is nevertheless still made. Like, humans have been around for much, much longer than that, and the majority of the time we didn't have this violent solutionism. We didn't mistake this one story as reality. And I wanted to give that piece because it's, again, returning it to William James, who we're about to get onto in the next reading bit. If you think of it as a book that you can kind of like, I don't know, maybe you're a cat with hands, close and put back up on the shelf in William James's Cosmic Library, it all suddenly becomes the right way of doing belief system shifting and other good chaos magic things, right? It's actually, this one doesn't work to make the world better, but the good news is it's new and kind of crap. It's like a bad book. So, and it's not even that it's a bad book. With all of these things, if you try to get it to describe everything in reality, you make it bad. But on its own, and funnily enough, I think Wink has that, there's something psychologically useful about living that story, as long as you don't mistake, as long as you don't live it every day and mistake the whole world for living it, right? So you actually can go on that identification process with a hero undergoing violence as that kind of inner experience. And arguably that's some of the benefits people get, apparently, from professional sport, right? And that's good. like redemptive violence works as a sporting event, right? Not as a descriptor of reality or a way of being political in the world. Do you know what I mean? So that's kind of, I wanted that one, and I think Wink does a really good job of characterizing it, or did a really good job, has since passed characterizing it, and if you put it on a Starship's timeline, it just makes it small enough to put away. And I think maybe that might be useful for some people, right? So the next thing is the William James What Makes a Life Significant is the name of the speech. And it occurred to him, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's long, like it's an hour-long Harvard lecture from, I think, 1902 or something, maybe a bit later than that. Anyway, the idea for it came to him as he went for a day and ended up staying for a week in the assembly grounds in Chautauqua. So this is a real American thing. There's some of it in Central Europe as well in the early 20th century, but that kind of sounds horrible now. Booze-free, healthy, somewhere between resort and camping living, where, you know, everyone's there in their Edwardian knee-length swimwear, fucking about by a lake, just being that weird kind of healthy nationalist virtuous thing. Anyway, I find that terrifying. But he didn't expect to enjoy it as much as he did. He went for a day and went for a week. But however, by the end of the week of sort of having everything taken care of and waking up feeling really good, and there's sunlight and exercise and healthy food and people aren't arguing or whatever, he found himself hungering for human drama again. So he said, like, made him suddenly long for something primordial and savage, even though it were as bad as an Armenian genocide. So he went from, oh, this is amazing, why don't we all live like this, to actually, I think life needs some kind of cut and thrust, right? And so he's on the train back thinking about that, and he lands on, well, this is very American, and I mean, it's why he's the quintessential American philosopher, pragmatism, etc., etc. And he lands on the immediate thing and say, well, what does that look like then? So if I don't want Armenian genocides. But what is a cut and thrust? And so he landed on the obvious place, which is the sort of nobility of work and the noble early 20th century working classes laying railroads, or kind of like pulling them up by then, to be honest, or getting close to it, and farms and building the great skyscrapers of Chicago and New York and all that kind of stuff. And he thought of that because the train's going through the great fields of heroism lying around me. And so it's kind of interesting. So he starts there, and then he lands on Tolstoy, and it's like, well, actually, maybe it's not the valorization, because there's something bougie and inaccurate about, and this is true, right? Like the sort of, and it's a problem with 19th century socialist thought, making the working classes magical and noble, like the noble savage. Especially as, and this is kind of where he kind of moves through Tolstoy and other examples of almost like a loss of magic in the working classes. Like, people are horrible. Rich people, working class people, the idea that your material circumstances alone, or the fact that you are, you know, planting grain, doesn't convey nobility or significance, because the speech is what makes a life significant. So it can't just be the physical act of rearranging the world in some kind of working class way, building a thing or planting a thing. That doesn't confer significance. And so he's like, okay, well, maybe it's intellectual. He's a professor, and he's like, well, maybe it's the grand intellectual pursuits, right? And goes through that and going, well, no, because if that's the case, as a lecturer, he would be the paragon of mankind. And he's like, and I'm not. So he spends 45 minutes of this talk this presentation. It's good, sort of going to and fro until he gets to the last chunk, which is the bit that I'm about to read, and he sort of lands on, like, I know I've been going backwards and forwards, so let me kind of explain myself and come to a conclusion. And that's where we're going to jump into William James's What Makes a Life Significant. But with all this beating and tacking on my part, I fear you take me to be reaching a confused result. I seem to be just taking things up and dropping them again. First, I took up Chautauqua and dropped that, then Tolstoy and the heroism of common toil and dropped them. Finally, I took up ideals and seem now almost dropping those. But please observe in what sense it is that I drop them. It is when they pretend singly to redeem life from insignificance. Culture and refinement all alone are not enough to do so. Ideal aspirations are not enough when uncombined with pluck and will. But neither are pluck and will, dogged endurance, and insensibility to danger enough when taken all alone. There must be some sort of fusion, some chemical combination among these principles for a life objectively and thoroughly significant to result. Of course, this is a somewhat vague conclusion, but in a question of significance, of worth, like this, conclusions can never be precise. The answer of appreciation, of sentiment, is always a more or a less, a balance struck by sympathy, insight, and goodwill. But it is an answer all the same, a real conclusion. And in the course of getting it, it seems to me that our eyes have been opened to many important things. Some of you are, perhaps, more livingly aware than you were an hour ago of the depths of worth that lie around you, hid in alien lives. And when you ask how much sympathy you ought to bestow, although the amount is truly enough a matter of ideal on your own part. Yet in this notion of a combination of ideals with active virtues, you have a rough standard for shaping your decision. In any case, your imagination is extended. You divine in the world about you a matter for a little more humility on your own part, and tolerance, reverence, and love for others, and you gain a certain inner joyfulness at the increased importance of our common life. Such joyfulness is a religious inspiration and an element of spiritual health, and worth more than the large amounts of that sort of technical and accurate information which we professors are supposed to be able to impart. To show the sort of thing I mean by these words, I will make just one brief practical illustration and then close. We are suffering today in America from what is called the labor question, and when you go out into the world, you will each and all of you be caught up in its perplexities. I use the brief term labor question to cover all sorts of anarchistic discontents and socialistic projects and the conservative resistances which they provoke. So far as this conflict is unhealthy and regrettable, and I think it is so only to a limited extent, the unhealthiness consists solely in the fact that one half of our fellow countrymen remain entirely blind to the internal significance of the lives of the other half. They miss the joys and sorrows. They fail to feel the moral virtue, and they do not guess the presence of the intellectual ideals. They are at cross purposes all along the line, regarding each other as they might regard a set of dangerously gesticulating automata, or, if they seek to get an inner motivation, making the most horrible mistakes. Often all that the poor man can think of in the rich man is a cowardly greediness for safety, luxury, and effeminacy, and a boundless affectation. What he is not a human being, but a pocketbook, a bank account. And a similar greediness, turned by disappointment into envy, is all that many rich men can see in the state of mind of the dissatisfied poor. And if the rich man begins to do the sentimental act over the poor man, what senseless blunders does he make, pitying him for just those very duties and those very immunities which, rightly taken, are the condition of his most abiding and characteristic joys. Each, in short, ignores the fact that happiness and unhappiness and significance are a vital mystery. Each pins them absolutely on some ridiculous feature of an external situation, and then everybody remains outside of everybody else's sight. Society has, with all this, undoubtedly got to pass towards some newer and better equilibrium. Sorry, William James. And the distribution of wealth has doubtless slowly got to change. Maybe. Such changes have always happened and will happen to the end of time. But if, after all that I have said, any of you expect that they will make any genuine vital difference on a large scale to the lives of our descendants, you will have missed the significance of my entire lecture. The solid meaning of life is always the same eternal thing. The marriage, namely, of some unhabitual ideal, however special, with some fidelity, courage, and endurance, with some man's or woman's pains. And whatever or wherever life may be, there will always be the chance for that marriage to take place. Fitzjames Stephen wrote many years ago to this effect, words to this effect, more eloquent than I can speak. The Great Eastern, which is a railway, or some of her successors, he said, will perhaps defy the roll of the Atlantic and cross the seas witut it's a boat and whatever, but he's talking about technology. I'll come back to it. The Great Eastern, or some of her successors, he said, will perhaps defy the roll of the Atlantic and cross the seas without allowing their passengers to feel that they have left firm land. The voyage from cradle to grave may come to be performed with similar facility. Progress in science may perhaps enable untold millions to live and die without a care, without a pang, without an anxiety. They will have a pleasant passage and plenty of brilliant conversation. They will wonder that men ever believed at all in clanging fights and blazing towns and sinking ships and praying bands, and when they come to the end of their course, they will go their way, and the place thereof will know them no more. But it seems unlikely that they will have such a knowledge of the great ocean on which they sail, with its storms and wrecks, its currents and icebergs, its huge waves and mighty winds, as those who battled with it for years together in the little craft, which, if they had few other merits, brought those who navigated them full into their presence of time and eternity, their maker and themselves, and forced them to have some definite view of their relations to them and to each other. In this solid and tridimensional sense, so to call it, these philosophers are right who contend that the world is a standing thing, with no progress, no real history. The changing conditions of history touch only the surface of the show. The altered equilibriums and redistributions only diversify our opportunities and open chances for us for new ideals. But with each new ideal that comes into life, the chance for a life based on some old ideal will vanish. And he would needs be a presumptuous calculator who should with confidence say that the total sum of significances is positively and absolutely greater at any one epoch than at any other of the world. I'm speaking broadly, I know, and omitting to consider certain qualifications in which I myself believe, but one can make only one point in one lecture, and I shall be well content if I have brought my point home to you this evening in even a slight degree. There are compensations, and no outward changes of condition in life can keep the nightingale of its eternal meaning from singing in all sorts of different men's hearts. That is the main fact to remember. If we could not only admit it with our lips, but really and truly believe it, how our convulsive insistencies, how our antipathies and dreads of each other would soften down. If the poor and the rich could look at each other in this way, sub specie eternitatis, which is a thing I'll tell you about in a sec, how gentle would grow their disputes. What tolerance and good humor, what willingness to live and let live would come into the world. So, sub specie eternitatis is from the view of eternity, and it's a Leibniz from memory phrase. Basically, what William James is saying, I love this, that's why it's the name of the post, right? The nightingale of its eternal meaning from singing in all sorts of men's different hearts. What he's saying is that the material conditions of the world are a slight change. And when he says ideal, and he talks about it in the speech, if you want to go and read it, an ideal for him is a thought that you enact. So it doesn't even necessarily matter which thought it is. But to live a life of ideals is to physically be in the world in accordance with a story, right? And that's kind of why I wanted to put these two in conversation, Wink and James in conversation, and to put this show in conversation with the last post in the last show. So new ideals, some ideals are leaving the world. There are things that we never get back. And I know this is coming back to the despair bit. A lot of us, including myself, have spent a lot of time in grief and sometimes despair about the things that you wanted to happen that just aren't, like, ever happening. So there are some ideals leaving the world. There are other ideals emerging into it. And his point is like, well, this sort of thing always happens. And the point is, he closing the speech going, and it's 100 years ago, we may reach a time where essentially all like UBIs and drone delivered food, we may get to a point where you don't have to do shit, is what he's saying. And that wouldn't be good. That wouldn't be living in accordance with ideals, that combination of picking a story and living it in the world. Now, there's a lot of medicine in those last few paragraphs, right? Because it's fine, some things are going away, other things are emerging, and you get one life. This is a sort of Neil Gaiman thing, or at least Death in Sandman says this. You get what everyone gets, which is one lifetime. And I think what I was looking for in William James is exactly that the material conditions are only minor in the quest for what makes a life significant. If you go back to different periods of history, anywhere and anywhen, the material conditions are different, some better, some worse, and so on. But the challenge, that sort of like, is to allow that nightingale of eternal meaning to sing in hearts and to recognize that it does in other people's hearts as a way of moving past. He's got a rich-poor polarization, which is certainly in play now, but we have endless polarizations to choose from at the moment, because polarization is one of those terrible stories run amok. But I like that. And it just kind of, it was another Galaxy Brain moment, because I studied William Butler Yeats at school. And so there's a Sailing to Byzantium angle to the Keep the Nightingale of its Eternal Meaning singing. Although I think that poem is trash. It's a beautiful poem, but the ideas behind it are trash. Anyway, so those are the two thinkers I wanted to put in discussion or dialogue in your heads as a companion to that process of seeing despair as a dissolution of the container that you expected the answer of, like what you wanted your life to be, to come in so that the actual answer can arrive. Because James says that like the answer or the new ideals will be emerging in the context of the conditions in which future peoples, which is us, live through. But that process is still the same. It's still the same of like materially living in the world in accordance with ideals. And ideals are stories. So that's where I put the wink cats in the library thing in it, right? So find the multi-dimensional ideal that is emerging because it will be there. And that's the despair process. The new multidimensional ideal will be coming through, right? Because that nightingale of eternal meaning endlessly sings in all sorts of different men's hearts, everywhere and everywhen. So that was my experimental solo show. I just wanted to table those ideas and put them in conversation in your head, and to do it in a performative aspect as part of moving back into the house, because we've had an ideal pivot that I now have to, well, not have to, but I'm now living in accordance with altered ideals as a result of changes in material conditions, and realizing that they're not like the purpose is to live in accordance with that ideal anyway. So it all kind of has to nest in that hyperdimensional kind of metaphoric process. But yeah, that's this month or this week's, I don't know how I'm going with my shows, podcast, and normal programming will resume soon. Actually, I thought I was going to be able to have this done in one take, which would have been amazing, but then I went and fed the ducks, and it occurs to me I want to really nail in one sentence why these two thinkers are in dialogue in this episode, and it's basically work out what is trying to come into the world through you. So it's a imaginal or dreaming model. This is kind of my description of what William James means about in accordance with ideals, regardless of material conditions. It's sort of true that find the thing that is trying to come into the world through you, and it is always your decision, consequently, to allow or not stories like the myth of redemptive violence to come into the world. They only come into the world through us. So that's it. Find what is trying to come into the world through you. That is the nightingale of eternal meaning. Until next time.